All right, so we are going to wrap up our civil rights reform in the 1960s conversation today. Don't forget the key terms. To be able to's. Okay, this is an image from the Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's March on Washington, as you can see here in this image, it says led by Reverend Ralph Abernathy. Martin Luther King Jr. had been heavily involved in the planning of this march. This is what that video was referencing the other day when we were listening to the story of his assassination, about how they were going to lead this Poor People's March to Washington. So it does go forward after his death. It says that in this image, the Poor People's Campaign marches through Atlanta in 1968, May of 1968, to promote economic justice, draw conclusions about how the goal of this march differed from previous civil rights demonstrations. So, let's start at the top. The civil rights movement had begun gaining momentum in the 50s when President Dwight Eisenhower was presiding over a time of peace and prosperity. But even during this optimistic era, Eisenhower era, there were a number of issues that caused Americans grave concern. The launch of Sputnik showed that the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union was still intense. The U-2 spy plane incident demonstrated that the Cold War might heat up at a moment's notice. Deep, unsettled problems remained for a new decade and a new generation of leadership. So we're moving into an election of JFK here. You know, he runs against Nixon. And again, we're sort of going back and forth between who is president and when. We've talked about Eisenhower. We've already talked a little bit about Kennedy, but here is how the sort of popular vote shakes out. It's a pretty close election, but Kennedy edges out Nixon in his initial bid for office. There's a clip down here I'll play in a second. The debate between Kennedy and Nixon is the first televised presidential debate. Nixon and Kennedy are both offered makeup, like a powder to wear on TV. Nixon says no, he's not wearing makeup. Kennedy says yes, and it makes a really big difference. Nixon comes across as super sweaty and nervous. You can sort of see in that picture he's not quite sure what to do with his body on TV, where to put his hands, how to sit, whereas Kennedy comes across as poised and calm, cool, and collected. He's not sweaty because he's wearing that face powder. And you can sort of see why more people may have gravitated towards Kennedy. Kennedy selects LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, to be his vice president. Johnson is from Texas, and having a Southerner, somebody who knew how to work with Congress on the ticket, was very helpful. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I just kind of want you to get a little bit of an indication of their different TV personalities.
The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency. The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy. According to rules set by the candidates themselves, each man shall make an opening statement of approximately 8 minutes duration and a closing statement of approximately 3 minutes duration. In between, the candidates will answer or comment upon answers to questions put by a panel of correspondents. In this, the first discussion in a series of 4 joint appearances, the subject matter has been agreed will be restricted to internal or domestic American matters.
Okay. I'm just going to move on. The space race is going on all at the same time as this civil rights legislation is being passed. And so I do want to sort of emphasize the country doesn't stop and deal with civil rights issues. It's walking and chewing gum at the same time, right? There's a lot going on. Kennedy says, I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon. What would it signal to the world if communists have a successful space program and the capitalists don't? Of course, the Soviets are the first to space with the launch of Sputnik. In 1957, a space satellite that orbits the Earth, and then in 1961, they send the first man to space, Yuri Gagarin. In 1962, we sent our first man to space, John Glenn, later a congressman, followed quickly by 68 Saturn V and the Apollo space missions. In July of 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins land on the moon. Kennedy's determination to change life at home resulted in his domestic agenda, which was called the New Frontier. So Kennedy's domestic agenda is called the New Frontier. Faced with a conservative Congress, Kennedy met with opposition as he fought to turn his vision into a reality. Still, he had some success in making changes in Social Security benefits, dealing with poverty and racial discrimination, and spurring new interests and expectations for the space program. Kennedy's also famous for saying, "My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So he does promote this new frontier idea, but he does have not a clear mandate, right? The election between him and Nixon was pretty narrow. So he really has some success when he allows Johnson to help him make compromises with the Southerners, with the Republicans in the Senate. So what are some of his successes? Well, deficit spending leads to job creation and also economic growth. There has to be a lot of deficit spending to fund the space program. Deficit spending is essentially going into debt, spending money you don't have. They passed the Area Redevelopment Act and the Housing Act. What are some problems? Well, it oftentimes results in a strained relationship with the business community. Tax cuts fail. They either only help the wealthy. Money for senior health insurance isn't expanded, and there's very little money for public education. He has a number of commissions, though, and a number of strides forward when it comes to the inclusion of women and also people with disabilities. In 1961, we have the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act. Esther Peterson becomes an Assistant Secretary of Labor and Director of the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. In 1961, we have the development of the President's Panel on Mental Retardation, which is not a term that is in use anymore, but Kennedy had family members who suffered from various degrees of not just mental health problems, but intellectual disabilities. And so that was an issue that was close to him. His sister, Eunice Shriver, is going to start the Special Olympics. During his first 2.5 years in office, Kennedy made the transition from politician to national leader. In foreign affairs, he confronted Soviet challenges, made hard decisions, and won the respect of Soviet leaders and American citizens. He also spoke eloquently about the need to move forward with a peaceful future. In domestic affairs, he finally came to the conclusion that the federal government had to lead the struggle for civil rights. Added to his new maturity was his ability to inspire Americans to dream noble dreams and work toward lofty ends. He is, of course, assassinated. This is an image of him in Dallas, Texas, right before he's assassinated on November 22nd of 1963. And we're going to talk more about Kennedy from a political perspective soon. He's assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. There is something called the Warren Commission, named after Chief Justice of the Supreme Court Earl Warren, that is established to determine whether or not he was the sole gunman. It does determine that he was. Lee Harvey Oswald will in turn be killed by Jack Ruby, and that's what you see in the bottom left image, is Jack Ruby killing. Jack Ruby was a nightclub owner in Dallas, Texas, and Lee Harvey Oswald is being led out of the jail, and there you see Jack Ruby stepping forward and shooting and killing him ultimately. LBJ will become president, and his social programs, so Kennedy's were called the New Frontier. LBJ's social programs will be called the Great Society. So it says, LBJ, who became president after Kennedy's assassination, shared the same goals as his predecessor. These goals shaped the purpose of Johnson's Great Society program. He was a seasoned politician, and he successfully pushed through significant domestic legislation that he hoped would become the first step to achieving the quality of life he thought all Americans should enjoy. In the spring of 1964, in a speech at the University of Michigan, Johnson outlined his vision for America. Calling it the Great Society, he said that during the past 100 years, Americans had spread across the continent, developed industrially, and created great wealth, but the work of America was not complete. So this is a really good chart explaining the legacy of the Great Society. So increased funding for elementary and secondary education, increased expenditure on Medicaid and Medicare, and a decline of the poverty rate. Now, a lot of his programs are able to pass because he can say this is what Kennedy wanted. And of course, there's such a great upswelling of support for Kennedy after his assassination that it really enables him to have a lot of success with his Great Society program. These are the men of the Supreme Court who preside over a lot of the civil rights legislation that we're talking about. The guy in the middle is Earl Warren. We're going to be doing a special assignment on the Warren Court. But his sort of, this is called the Civil Rights Court, and the categories of cases can be broken into cases about prayer and privacy, reapportionment, which has to do with representation, and also extending due process. It's a short video, but we're going to talk more about all of it.
In this edition of the History Channel's 47-part series on the Supreme Court, we will take an in-depth look at the Warren Court, the Civil Rights Court. First things first, let's get to know our key judges.
I'm going to pause that there, actually, and we'll come back with a separate assignment in just a little bit in the folder. I'm losing my train of thought here. U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. So this is also something that we'll be delving into a little bit in our folder work, but essentially it has to do with who is immigrating and from where, and you can see which groups are growing. And I want you to look at this chart and think about which ethnic group is projected to grow the most, projected to grow the most by 2050. And we'll also be doing some more work with this. So, all right, thanks, guys. Notes are done.